Welcome to Washington Watch with Congressman Walter Jones. Each month, we take a look at the events happening in Washington, D.C. and how they affect our lives here in eastern North Carolina.
Beautiful little horse. It is God's gift to the world. So thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you for...
And now, here's your Congressman, Walter Jones.
Welcome to the June edition of Washington Watch. Today's guest is Trevor Potter, the founding president and general counsel of the Campaign Legal Center. He is a well-known campaign and election lawyer who helped defend the McCain-Feingold law in court, and he has served as both a commissioner and chairman of the Federal Election Commission. Mr. Potter is a graduate of Harvard College and the University of Virginia School of Law. It is a very timely opportunity for those of us in eastern North Carolina to have Mr. Potter. As you know, that outside money is becoming more and more of a factor to try to influence people in eastern North Carolina and throughout the state of North Carolina. Trevor, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
Trevor, you have such a background and experience in this area that many of the people that I have the privilege to represent were actually turned off by the negative ads, and not so much from the opponent, but from the outside groups. I have said many times, because I am a pro-life member of Congress, that the two worst decisions since I have been in Congress were Roe v. Wade and Citizens United. Citizens United is about 4 years old. It was a decision made by the Supreme Court. I think it was a 5-4 decision. And I would like to start our discussion with the issue of Citizens United and how that has impacted our elections.
We've seen an enormous change since that Citizens United decision, and there have been a couple others that have followed that have made it worse even. What Citizens United said is that corporations, and implicitly unions also, have a right to make unlimited expenditures in elections to defeat candidates or elect candidates. Up until then, the law for most of the 20th century had been that individuals who vote could spend money in elections. Corporations could voluntarily collect individual money and spend it through what's called a PAC, but they couldn't actually go out and spend this corporate money. So that was the first big change, is saying, no, all this money that hasn't been allowed before can now be spent in elections, but it has to be for these outside ads. You can't give it to a candidate still, but you can go out and make these independent expenditures. Now, when the court said that, entirely aside from whether this is right and constitutional and makes any sense, and it is contrary to what a lot of previous Supreme Courts had said, so this is a departure from precedent, but they made a couple mistakes in the decision which we're now paying for. One of them is they said that all this spending would be fully disclosed so that citizens would know who was communicating with them and who they favored and why, and who was in what they called the pocket of the special interests. And they said shareholders will know how their money is being spent so that they don't want their corporation to intervene in politics or support a candidate. They could object. It's not worked out that way. In fact, most of this corporate money is secret. It's anonymous. It goes to groups that don't have to disclose who their donors are. So that's a big problem. And it's not what the court told us was going to happen. The other problem is the court said that this spending would be wholly and completely independent of candidates and parties, that it would be a group really outside of the current political system. And the idea was that that was their independent speech. The reality, of course, is that many of these groups are Washington-based. They all have ties in the political world and to parties, often directly to candidates. And the reason that's a problem is that the court said this independent spending is okay because it can't corrupt the system. But the reality is, you know, the candidates know who's spending all this money. The public may not, but the candidates are going to find out. There's nothing wrong with someone going in and saying, don't worry about this. If you run, I'll spend a fortune to elect you. Or don't worry, if you come in and run, I have some friends who will spend a fortune. You're going to be beholden if that's what happens. Even if you haven't had that conversation, I think there's a corruption danger. If someone comes in and spends a couple $1 million and elects a member of Congress, that member is going to be grateful. And I think the court made a mistake in thinking that that somehow is not corrupt and therefore can't be regulated.
Well, Trevor, if the court did make a mistake, which I believe you're right, they've made a mistake, how would Congress try to address the problem, in your opinion?
Well, I think Congress can start in two important ways that would really change what's happening. And that is to give us the system that the court thought we were going to have, full disclosure of the sources of all this money. At the moment, if an ad is run in North Carolina, it says something like, paid for by Americans for a better country. Now, there are different types of groups. Some of them disclose their donors, but the average person in North Carolina isn't going to know who those donors are and where to find it. Others absolutely don't disclose their donors, and that tends to be where the special interest money, the corporate and union money goes, because they don't want to show their hand. They don't want North Carolinians to know that it's New York bankers or California unions who are spending all this money in North Carolina. So they run it through this Americans for a Better Country. You can't figure out who they are. You have a general idea, but only a general idea as a voter. Sometimes not even that. They don't talk about the issues that their funders care about. They talk about what they think might win the election. So disclosing that would make a huge difference. And Congress can clearly pass a law saying you have to disclose the sources of all this money. That's what Congress thought they did when they passed McCain-Feingold in 2002. But my old agency, the Federal Election Commission, has basically gutted that requirement. They came in and said, well, you only have to disclose your donors if somebody gave for the purpose of spending money on that ad in that district. Well, nobody does that. Nobody admits to doing that. And so there's now no disclosure. But Congress could fix the disclosure side. And I think that's important because then the voters in North Carolina know who's really speaking, where this money is coming from. And they can say, well, what is it that those people are trying to buy in our district? So disclosure is important. Congress could also do something about the independence of these groups so that they are not really just another wing of the party or a candidate. Again, the Federal Election Commission rules allow a great deal of coordination, what you and I would call coordination. They say it's just if you edit the ads or approve the particular ads, but you have candidates out there raising money for these supposedly independent groups. You have people Absolutely. Who used to work for candidates or are advisors to candidates or longtime fundraisers for candidates who then go out, say, I'm now going to start an independent group. I want to raise a couple $1 million in unlimited secret money, and I'm going to support my buddy. And that's not what the court envisioned. So you could do those without any changes in the court's current doctrine.
Well, it's my hope. A couple of years ago, Bob Ney, who was a former congressman from Ohio, that got in trouble with Jack Abramoff and a lobbyist, and in fact, Bob ended up in federal prison, and while being in prison, he wrote a book. And I saw him on C-SPAN a couple years ago after he got finished his service in the federal pen, and Brian Lamb asked him something I will never forget, and this ties into what we're talking about. He asked Bob Ney, do you think Congress is getting any more honest, so to speak, lobbyists and money and this type of thing? And Bob Ney said no. And Brian said, why do you think Congress has not done something about it? And he said, because the leadership of the Republican Party and the leadership of the Democratic Party seem to like it the way it is. And I think it's going to take a national movement, people like yourself who are experts, people like yourself who fully understand the Constitution and the intent of some of these rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court to really energize the American people. And that's why I wanted you on our show today, because I want people to know that there is a way that we can bring a little bit of integrity, if there should be any, in campaigns, because I think right now it is out of control. And I think they're talking about in North Carolina, Trevor, that the Senate race, the Republican will be Tom Tillis, the Speaker of the House, and he would be challenging Senator Kay Hagan. And people are already saying that counting money that's already been spent and money that's going to be coming from outside sources that we're talking about now, this could be a $70 million race. It is unacceptable, because if there's any chance to have good government for the average person like me, this is not the way to guarantee good government.
Well, and the question then becomes, where are the people in North Carolina in this? If it's a $70 million race, most of that money is not going to be spent by the two candidates, and you can be sure most of that money is not going to come from people in North Carolina. So you've got the rest of the country trying to dictate who wins that election with outside, often secret money. And that's not what the founders had in mind. I mean, they envisioned that North Carolina would be sending representatives to Washington. Former Supreme Court Justice Stevens recently testified before Congress, and he said, you know, we need to go back and look at some of these basic questions, and he named two of them that I think are important. One is, what does being a representative mean in our constitutional system? Going back to conservative constitutional principles, when the states send representatives to Washington, shouldn't they really be selected by the states? Mm-hmm. Is it right to have much more money coming in from outside a state to determine who their congressmen and senators are than from inside? Doesn't that drown out the people of North Carolina? And when you're talking about, you know, $70 million, the reality is that almost nobody in North Carolina has that kind of money.
No, absolutely.
The figures are that even down, if you look at the low level of disclosed contributions of $200, which is where your name then turns up as a donor on the public records, 99 2/3% of Americans do not give that minimum amount that means they are counted as a participant in the system. So you have 1/3% at the moment that's actually spending any money in this election, and we know the 70 million is going to come from a tiny, tiny percent of that. So one of the points, I think Stevens is right. We have to talk about, you know, outside money. Is this what our founders really had in mind? Is this what the Constitution is about? And the other issue is, you go back to Ney and Abramoff, and of course that was a famous corruption scandal. Right. But one of the things that Jack Abramoff, the lobbyist who was convicted and went to prison, said, he said the true scandal here is that I could have done almost everything I did legally. If I didn't have such a swelled ego, I could have followed the law, still effectively corrupted Congress, and not gone to jail for it because it would have been okay. And I think that's the other issue we need to look at here, which is, what is it the American people want out of their elective system and out of their legislatures in North Carolina and their representatives in Washington? Because the current Supreme Court that gave us Citizens United has said people are not going to be concerned with selling access, with selling meetings, with the idea that large donors are going to get gratitude from representatives and special treatment. That's not going to diminish confidence in our government. I don't know what planet that they're living on, but that seems to me to be the problem, that people in North Carolina and elsewhere think their representatives have been bought by somebody else, or at least are in danger of it. And the more money that gets spent in the way we're talking about and secretly, the more they're going to think these people don't represent me. So I think that, you know, that's a problem that our founders faced. They were very concerned about what they called corruption, and by that they meant a very privileged few being able to essentially buy access and affect the results of the people's representatives. And I worry that that's where we're going, and the fact that this Supreme Court thinks that's okay, that it only if it's bribery. If I spend $1 million to elect you, or give money to you and get access and meetings and a chance to lobby you, that's okay. It's only if I give you the cash in return for your vote that it's a problem. I don't think most people think that. I don't think our founders thought that.
I think the founders would be very disappointed and maybe even disgusted if they knew the system that we are operating under now. I wanted to know, on the Senate, I believe Tom Udall has put a constitutional amendment type bill in that maybe the Senate is going to debate sometime in the next couple of weeks, that would allow the states to say to the Congress, we want you to do something about this problem. Can you speak a little bit about Tom's bill? Have you had a chance to look at it?
I have had a chance to look at it, and the Senate is going to debate it. I mean, I'd start by saying that as you and I know, the important thing here will be that it's a debate. It will draw public attention to this issue, and it will get people thinking about what we need to do. The reality is it's not going to have the votes to pass in the Senate.
Sadly.
It has to have a 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress before it gets sent to the states, and then 3/4 of the states would have to ratify it. So it's an uphill battle, but I think the point at this stage is to focus on what the problem is. The bill is pretty, the proposed amendment is pretty straightforward. What it says is that Congress and the states can regulate the spending of money in politics for and against candidates to ensure a level playing field, in addition to preventing corruption, to see that Americans hear all voices, that people have a chance to participate and they're not drowned out. And then it says, but nothing in this shall in any way regulate the press. So that's the outlines of the bill, and it would overturn the Supreme Court's decision that says you can only regulate money to prevent, basically now, actual bribery. So that's the goal. I think there are questions about how it would be interpreted. This is a difficult thing to do because if you make the amendment too broad and say basically Congress can write any law it wants relating to money in politics, you run the risk of jeopardizing freedom of the press and freedom of speech. On the other hand, if you make it too vague and you say you can only do reasonable things and you can't deal with the press and so forth, you run the risk that the same Supreme Court that got us into this mess is going to be interpreting the amendment and may not be as broad as you want. So an amendment, I think, is a good opportunity to have this conversation.
Trevor, I think, again, the point you made was so well made that if the Senate just debates it, whether the bill, the constitutional amendment, is perfect or not, the problem is up here that we really don't debate reform issues. I've been very dismayed. I was a reformer in the North Carolina House of Representatives 100 years ago. And I've been very dismayed, except for the McCain-Feingold. I don't remember that we've actually had a reform bill since that bill was on the floor of the House. And I think it's going to take the education, and you've already said this, of the American people. So I hope that Senate does have a 1 to 2 week debate on the Udall amendment, because I think it is important. Too many people don't feel that we have any opportunities to change because the system, as Bob Ney said, the system we have, those in leadership seem to like it. And I think it is a very corruptive type system. We've got a few minutes. I wonder if you respond to that again.
I think you're right that, first of all, people like what they know. They're nervous about jumping off without knowing where they're going to land. So they think, well, we got here under this system. It worked for us. Secondly, I think the way the system currently works does give the leadership a lot of power internally. Absolutely. Because they can direct outside money. They're not legally supposed to say to an outside group, spend X million on that race, but they certainly can indicate they hope that this money is going to be spent and work with the people who are spending it. They can even help raise it within limits. And so you see the leaders of both parties going out, meeting with these super PAC donors, cultivating the billionaires, literally, who they hope are going to come in on their side. And so they're now working hand in glove with these couple people on the outside who can finance the whole thing. And that's been the big change in our election. There used to be limits, and everyone had the same limit. Now, it's true that a billionaire could spend up to $100,000, but that's not going to change the whole system. Now a billionaire could spend $1 billion.
That might help change
the
system.
And that does, that's a different world, and I don't think we've really adjusted to that yet. The other point you make is that to some extent these leaders are captives of these outside groups. Each party has
Right.
big, important groups that now can spend more money than they used to spend before. So for the Democrats, it's the labor unions, it's the trial lawyers, and the leadership isn't going to do something that they don't like. And on the Republican side, it'll be the Chamber of Commerce or some of these corporate interests who have something very specific they want from Congress or something they want to block. And the outside groups, by being able to spend this unlimited amount of money, can really control your agenda, what gets to the floor. You're a reformer, but if the leadership isn't going to let you bring a bill up, it doesn't do any good. And they're not going to bring a bill up if the people on, the outsiders on their side are saying, don't do that. And on disclosure, that's what's happened in Congress on the Republican side. The groups that do not want disclosure because they think they can raise and spend more money and have more power if it's done in secret, those are the groups that have been leaning on the Republican leadership to say, don't let that bill come up.
Well, your analogy is 100% correct. I have been very disappointed and dismayed in the fact that since I've been here, it seems like the influence of outside groups and on both parties continues to grow and influence, and that actually we have a closed system here in the House where if the Speaker or the Majority Leader do not want a bill on the Republican side to get to the floor of the House, it doesn't get there. Trevor, we have just about a minute left, and I want to thank you for who you are, what you stand for, and the fact that you bring the debate about the need for honesty, openness, and integrity, if that can even be used in campaigns anymore. And I believe sincerely that we will have, if we all get back in 2015, I think we're going to have a debate that, quite frankly, needs to happen if we're going to have good government in America. Thank you for being on the show today. I really and sincerely appreciate it. Thank you.
I thank you. This is an important topic. I'm glad you're taking lead on it. And I think the country is hoping that both of us will work hard on it.
Thank you so much. Glenn Downs, my Chief of Staff, will be with us in about 30 seconds. Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman.
The second part of our show today, I'm pleased to have Glenn Downs, my Chief of Staff, and thank you, Glenn, for being on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me back once again, Congressman Jones. And as I always like to say, the people of the 3rd District are not shy about contacting you in your office to express concerns. And a very timely concern is the ongoing scandal in veterans health care and the Veterans Administration. Quickly, can you just give me a quick overview of where you think that stands? And then I want to ask you some questions about the broader issues.
Glenn, we know there's a serious problem. Our veterans have earned their benefits by fighting for this country, giving their life for this country. And we in the Greenville office, Jason Lowery, we're doing everything we can to find a solution to the problem. But it's a national problem, but we are working with other members of Congress in both parties to see if we can get this problem moving in the right direction for a solution.
Well, one of the things I'd like to broaden the topic out a little bit on is there's this whole question about, hey, if you can't afford to take care of veterans, you can't afford to go to war. And that you've expressed a lot of concern over time that the government in Washington, D.C. was not properly anticipating ongoing costs that were going to continue in terms of veterans health care long after wars like in Afghanistan and Iraq were over. Can you talk about some of the things you have thought about that in the lead up to this current scandal, if you will?
Well, it does tie in, Glenn. Last week we debated the NDAA bill, National Defense Authorization Act, and Jim McGovern and I had an amendment that we could not get approved for debate on the floor that would say that after 2016, should the President decide that he wants to increase the number of troops in Afghanistan, that we in Congress would have a debate and we would vote whether we agree to increase the troops level or not. And we couldn't even get that approved. That's a frustration because we're spending billions of dollars in Afghanistan every month that could be spent on our veterans in eastern North Carolina and across this nation.
Well, one of the points that you've made in the past was that if all spending stopped overseas and these conflicts immediately, and all the troops were brought home immediately, there would still be for years and years to come expenses that no one's really been accounting for. I think Professor Joseph Stiglitz wrote a book about that.
$4 trillion war. And that book was based strictly on Iraq, not factoring in Afghanistan in a 12-year war. And so his projection was that it would cost $4 trillion to take care of the wounded from the Iraq war. And then if you factor in Afghanistan, you probably can double that. There were his terms, not mine, about doubling the $4 trillion to $8 trillion.
So it seems to me right now part of the problem with this scandal, this ongoing scandal in terms of secret waiting lists and things like that in the Veterans Administration is it's not like VA doctors and hospitals or hospital beds are empty and the VA doctors are sitting there twiddling their thumbs, is that there's more demand for the service than they've got the ability to provide the service. So they're, part of what's going on is they're hiding the wait list and things like that. And you've argued really there's more to come.
Absolutely. Glenn, you articulated the problem much better than I have, and that's exactly right. We had not anticipated 12 years of war. We had not anticipated the kind of injuries that many of our heroes have received, both physically and mentally, and it is going to continue to put strain on the system. And we've got to figure out in Washington how we can take that strain off the system by trying to help these veterans have a better quality of life.
Well, it's interesting, as we're taping here today, there are voices here in Washington really beating the drums loudly for the United States to get involved in even more conflicts overseas. Is there anybody here or kind of connecting the two dots? On one hand, even people that want this muscular interventionist sort of overseas policy saying, hey, if we do this, we need to reserve money over here for the veterans that are going to be needing services 30 years down the road. Is there anybody that's connecting those two dots together?
Glenn, sadly, your point again is so well made, because no, we're not. This is kind of like when the problem hits us, we react to it, and we're not planning for the next not attack, but problems that would be forthcoming from being involved in these other countries.
Well, we're down to just under a little minute to go here, so we can't go too much more on this, but at the same time, this is all taking place in the context of continuing to rack up more and more and more debt. You see any relief on that side here in Washington this year?
It would take the American people to start putting pressure on their members of the House and the members of the Senate to say, stop spending the money overseas, spend it here to take care of our country and our veterans. And Glenn, I'm sorry it went so fast. Good questions, good comments, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this June edition of Washington Watch. I hope you found it very interesting program today. Thank you.
Okay, so just as is, just clear the water and that's it? Yeah.